All right, TK, when you were flying out of Phuket with the 615th Tactical Fighter Squadron, if I recall correctly,
Phan Rang.
Phan Rang,
Mm-hmm.
what call signs were being used at that time, if you remember, at Phan Rang and by the 615th?
Well, our call sign was Panther, Black Panther, which would, in today, or at least shortly after that time, was probably a euphemism that you shouldn't be, remember the organization, the Black Panthers, but that was our squadron call sign, and also our patch was the Black Panther. So that's what we were using, if I remember right. I'm sure that's what we were using. Yeah.
Now, and at that time at Phan Rang, were there any other wings and other fighter squadrons and aircraft operating out of Phan Rang?
Well, yeah, we had the only other ones out there. Of course, there was rescue helicopters for at every base, but we also had a FAC unit out of there that were flying bird dogs, and but that was separate, and that was a detachment. I don't think it was a wing. Now, in our wing, we did have the Syracuse National Guard was stationed at our base on a deployment and assigned to the wing. But the actual wing, active duty wise, had three squadrons: the 14th, 15th, and the 352nd were based there, along with the Syracuse F-100s. They were flying C models. Were there deployed, and also the Bird Dog OV-1 was there and I think they also had some OV-2s there. The push-pull Cessnas were there strictly as forward air controllers.
Well, and that ties in perfectly to the next question I had, is that with the OV-1s and OV-2s there at Phan Rang, did your squadron work with them in any of the forward air control and close air support?
We would, generally speaking, because of their range and their time it takes for them to get on target, depending upon where we're fragged. Now, if we were fragged down in 4 Corps, down south of Saigon down there, no, they would not. That was not their sector. In other words, they didn't do recon or forward air controlling in that particular area. Those people would have come out of Benoit, let's say. So most of our OV-1s and 2s that were there were strictly in 3 Corps, is where they operated. 2 Corps and some in 3 Corps. But so if you were fragged in that particular area, and most of our fragging was either in 4 Corps or 3 Corps. We did not get up to I Corps at all. That was mainly handled from at that time out of Phuket or out of Tuiwa, 2 bases north of us. In the Central Highlands where we were always usually fragged in 3 Corps and 4 Corps, which is down the Delta. And down in the Delta, mainly our targets of opportunity were boats, sampans, and things like that on the water that were moving equipment, people, what have you, around. And so that was so. In our FACs, most all of them stayed in 2 Corps, and some of them went down part of 3 Corps. But the biggest group that we work with came out mainly south of Saigon or out of Benoit.
Now, speaking of some of these targets as well, working further down south, you mentioned working along the Delta. When you saw these targets of opportunity, would you have to request clearance, or did you?
Oh yeah, yeah. You never had carte blanche on any targets. Everything except when you were on alert, everything was fragged. Everything came out of 7th Air Force the day before, given to the squadron, and it was you sat down and briefed 2 hours before departure on what your mission was, where you were going, who you were working with, call sign, how to contact them, orbit point where you met them, and everything else. Got your briefing from the FAC, and then went ahead and went into target. Like I said, the juicy missions, if you want to call them juicy, were off alert because it wasn't fragged. I mean, it was usually troops in contact, our positions being overrun, and they needed air support immediately. So those were the good missions. The daily missions down south, I wouldn't say that they were blah, oh hum, because you got shot at quite a bit. But they did not have the thrill, the excitement that the missions on alert were usually all at night. So that made them really, really interesting because day alerts, yeah, we had, but if you wanted a really good mission, volunteer, stick your hand up for being on alert at night.
Well, and jumping ahead a little bit, but it's caught my attention when you volunteer for those night alerts, and if you get called out and sent out on an alert for troops in contact, when you arrive on station, can you see the firefight below you with the various tracer rounds?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. You can see them coming at you. You can see them, firing at each other, and yeah, it's very noticeable. Yep. Yep.
And with that too, when you've got a night alert, is there also a night FAC that's out there guiding you in with the Willie Pete round, and
Yep.
then of course
Yep.
telling you what directions?
Yep. Absolutely. You never dropped an ordnance without having clearance from a forward air controller. Even if you had what we call sky spots, where the weather was so bad and you didn't want to take that ordnance home, and you just droned along at 20,000 feet, and he says, "Go ahead, drop now." Obviously he had you. You gave him your position, so he kept you clear of any villages or anywhere that you might have an inadvertent drop on the civilian population. But a lot of the time, when the weather was really, really bad, we would just do a sky spot. And if he was doubtful about whether we could do a safe sky spot, I mentioned to you before, that's when we came back and dropped him in the South China Sea.
Well, and for these night alerts, that of course, how many did you ever get called out upon with troops in contact? Do you remember?
Well, now, I don't remember exactly. Let's say out of the 150 missions I flew in the South, about 25% of them came off the alert pad. So doing the math, let's say 40 missions, 35, 40 missions, something like that. Of those 35 or 40, troops in contact were all of them. Otherwise, if you're on alert and you're going to be scrambled, it's because there's an emergency out there and someone's getting shot at real bad. You weren't called off alert just to go out there and drop a bomb somewhere. So all of them were troops in contact.
Well, and I know too, following with 1967 onward, a lot of the NVA and Viet Cong tactics were to try to get us close to American ground troops to prevent them utilizing air support for fear of dropping short, of course, on friendlies down below. And so, from your perspective, I mean, it's got to be pretty hairy going on a lot of those runs.
And I'm sure, thought about that many, many times. And I'm sure that inadvertently we probably hit some of our own troops. I know that one, we got an assessment back on one that was pretty hairy at night. I think I mentioned it to you, that we had to drop napalm. And napalm is not a nice ordnance to drop anyway. And the reason that they called and wanted napalm is because the enemy was within 10 yards of overrunning his post. And napalm, you get down and you drag your rear end through the grass and drop it. You don't drop it from a high altitude. And they reported back next day. They said that we had eliminated 150 some odd enemy troops. But I'm with that in mind, as close as those troops were, I'm sure we probably hit some friendlies. That was never relayed to us, and I didn't want to know, but I thought about it. Yeah.
Well, and with those thoughts and thinking about the combat from your perspective as a fighter pilot, how do you go on your day-to-day duties and tasks and keep that in the back of your mind?
Well, I think that foremost, you got to think that, well, when the Vietnam War was sort of not handled properly, let's say, there was a lot of animosity at home, and there was a lot of discontent with the troops over there about how it was being run. And so, but you were doing your job. In other words, when you raised your hand and took the oath of office of being in the military, and when you were assigned to an airplane and you got trained in that airplane, you were trained to do a mission. and you did the mission and you put all that in the back of your mind. If not, you'd be a closet case. You really would. And of course, that's prominent now amongst a lot of the people that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan is post-traumatic syndrome, distress syndrome. And especially with the troops that were down there eyeball to eyeball looking at them. I don't think that it happened too much in the cockpit because everything happened so fast. You really didn't see the results of your mission, which is probably just as well. A lot of times, like on that particular one, it got a big write-up because of the amount of damage that we imposed upon the enemy. And I don't know if they were NVA or if they were Viet Cong probably. But anyway, no, you can't dwell on it. You really can't.
Well, and speaking of that aspect, did you in your time flying down south and eventually flying, of course, for up at Misty, at Troy Hoyt, did you ever see any pilots break down or lose their composure in your time?
No, no, I never did. And I never had an incident where someone refused to do a particular mission. No, and I'm sure that probably happened. And there were probably a few court martials over situations like that. But no, I never witnessed it.
Well, in your time flying down south as well, especially on these alerts, what's the clearance if we're dropping napalm or any kind of ordnance from ground to the height of the Sabre that's clear, so you don't have to worry about shrapnel getting thrown back into the plane?
Well, napalm, you don't worry about it. That's dropped down as low as you can possibly get. Now, if you got bombs on board, and the ordnance that we usually carried, if we had what we call triple ejection racks, which I mentioned to you before, we would hang 6 250-pound bombs. You couldn't put a 500-pound bomb on there. Okay, so and the minimum altitude for dropping those bombs and 500-pounders, which we dropped, was usually 1,000 feet. And these were all free fall ballistic bombs. There were no smart guided bombs. We didn't have that capability on the F-100, and we didn't have that capability during the Vietnam War at all on any airplane. So minimum altitude, if you're firing rockets and everything, was always about 1,000 feet, except napalm. Napalm was the only one. And also 20 Mike. If you had a situation where you're firing your cannons, you could take them down as low as you felt comfortable. Yeah.
Now, down south with a lot of these strikes that you end up running, how common was it to run into AA or AAA down south?
No. You never ran into anything but mainly what they call ZPUs, which I think were about 7.6 millimeter. And that's can be like a bazooka. I mean, it could be transportable. The rest of it was all small arms fire down south. Now, of course, the further you move north, like when we did the Laos Ho Chi Minh Trail, then it got pretty big. Yeah. I was trying to think exactly. We pinpointed. We knew, most all of that was on trucks, except your big ones, your 57s. They had to be on a permanent mount spot. And we pretty much, by the time we got there, I got to Misty, they knew where those were. And so we knew where not to go to miss the big guys. Now, the smaller ones, which was transportable, we didn't know. They would move them overnight and put them in different spots and what have you. So, but down south, small arms fire was basically all you really ran across.
Well, and I guess when you would find the missions up north and the operations room, I assume you've got a map up that shows, known AA sites and rings and where to avoid on your departures and when you're arriving on target.
Yep, absolutely. You're fairly well briefed and debriefed. In other words, that's how we found out what information we have is when we got back from a mission, we would go through a very intense debriefing with the intelligence people, tell them what we saw, what we know, what we think, and that information was then formulated and disseminated the next day for the next mission going out. So they would have current information as far as the placement of possible, enemy positions.
Now, for the debriefing, when you're being not interrogated, but essentially interrogated by intelligence about what you saw, is the whole flight in the room, or is each person in an individual room?
Oh no! Well, the whole flight's just two people.
Okay.
Yeah. No. Because that way you can collaborate on what you saw and verify and confirm. So it'd be two pilots and usually at least a couple intelligence people there. One would be asking the questions and one would be writing down the information, that type of thing. And that went on for, well, depending upon the mission. Usually you could debrief the intelligence officer within 30 minutes, of what you encountered on your mission.
So when you've flown these missions and you've engaged in contact and either, spent 20 Mike or you've dropped ordnance, would you take your own bomb damage assessment, or would another flight go do a BDA?
No, you'd have to. Usually the forward air controller would give you a BDA if he knew it. Whether you silence what you were shooting for or whatever. But then he would have to also send that back to the command post at 7th Air Force at Tan Son Nhut, and they would do the actual compiling and have to release every day for all of South Vietnam the battle damage assessment that was the previous day. And this would be disseminated to all the squadrons accordingly. Yep. So you got an initial from the forward air controller, and which was what he could see from his vantage point, because these guys weren't on the ground. They were in airplanes. And so it'd be sometimes tough to get an accurate BDA. But then after we departed, and RTB returned to base, he would pick up more information from the people on the ground who he was obviously in contact with, and get more detailed instructions on exactly what the damage might have been. So a lot of it was not really assembled until the next day, but you had an idea when you left the target of whether you were successful or not successful.
And I guess with the gun camera footage as well that was taken, or in anything in that regard, did that go into factor?
Yeah, that was yeah, because anytime that you, in other words, like that trigger gun that are that I mean the stick handle that I gave you the other day, I told you when you first press halfway on that button, that starts your camera rolling right there. And so all that really was taking was 20 Mike. You had no way of getting a photo view or a camera of any rockets or any bombs or napalm that you might drop. Those would be the three other ordinances. So all that gun camera film is all. I mean, that's what you would have to assess, and which was that was very valuable because we on every mission we expended all our ammunition, especially the 20 millimeter. That was very good. Those were good cannons. They were very accurate. And unfortunately, the quality of those cameras and the film quality, it's all black and white. And it was really, you had to know what you're looking at. In other words, if I handed it to you and you put it on a reel and started watching this thing, you say, oh, you could actually see, the tracers going out of your gun, but you really can't assess unless you know what you're looking for, what damage has been done. It wasn't a very good recon with the cameras we had. It wasn't very good at all.
Well, speaking of the 20 mics, and for the sake of the interview and the viewers, how effective was 20 Mike against soft targets like sampans or trucks?
Oh, very, very effective. Very effective. Yeah. We're talking about shells that are probably about 7-8 inches long, something like that. And you're firing at 6,000 rounds a minute. And you're firing at a low altitude. Usually you're down to 100, 200 feet, something like that. Now, if it was a real live target that was shooting back at you, you would tend to expend that ordnance a little bit higher. and you certainly wouldn't want to stay on target on any one run for maybe hose off maybe 3 or 4 seconds where the bullets, and then pull out and maybe come back in for another run. But you don't want to sit there and try and hose them down. But it was very effective. Yeah, that was. It was, in today's age, I guess you would call the A10 the warthog. It's known as a tank killer, and that's 20 Mike right there. And it's, I'm sure that today's tanks perhaps maybe not, but of course we never encountered any tanks over there. But I can't imagine that 20 millimeter would not take out most tanks in that era.
Well, and with that too, thinking about some of these gun runs and how effective high explosive 20 Mike is on open targets in itself, were there ever any situations where you found that 20 Mike was not effective?
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of situations where you didn't know if it was being effective. A lot of times, a forward air controller, maybe he had a long day, maybe things weren't going his way, and he wanted you to, use whatever ordnance you had. It's not a target that you could really see, and I'm not sure perhaps he could see it. So there was a lot of ordnance that was expended that probably did zero damage over there, zero. But I kind of think that the most effective was the fact that was your 20 millimeter, only because you're in the target. I mean, you're right on the target firing that off, and it comes out with a pattern. These cannons have to be, every so often, have to be harmonized, and what they do is they'll actually take an airplane and they'll put it up on jacks, because you have to have the gear up before the guns can be armed and fired, and then they chain it down, and they'll fire these guns into a target, and by that they'll just like a scope, you go ahead and realign it so your pattern would be what you would want. And these things are firing at such a force that you have to chain the airplane down, or the airplane is going to move backwards. Those cannons really had a lot of firepower. Unfortunately, they didn't have that much firepower because you only carried 800 rounds, and at 6,000 rounds a minute, you can imagine, do the math. You didn't have but several seconds of gunfire with that 20 millimeter.
Well, and even too, the thing about putting rounds on target, and when you've actively got a target shooting back at you in itself, that's got to be a pretty hairy situation, knowing that their guns are pointed up at you, and even small caliber rounds can still do damage.
Yeah, but the thing is, they're small caliber now, and they, even if they were hit you with small caliber, in other words, let's say an AR-47 or something like that, probably not going to do that much damage. The F-100 could take a lot and still run. It's when you got the heavier ordnance, artillery, AAA coming at you, where they fire tracers about every, fifth, sixth, seventh round, you'd have a tracer coming at you, because most of those up north, unless you ran across the big stuff, were not radar controlled. They were all manual. They were all, okay, let's fire a shot, and they'd watch the tracer come up and say, oh, let's make a correction. Sure, they were firing, but they were firing at random. There was no radar control like with the SAMs or with the large AAA. So down south, you took some shots, you took some hits and everything else, but small arms wasn't going to stop an F-100.
Now, when you're on target, and of course you're taking fire, can you hear the pops of rounds hitting the aircraft in itself through the fuselage?
Not small arms, but you can certainly hear artillery when it's firing at you, because they, each piece of ground equipment, artillery you came up against. Let's take ZPU. I think that's about 13 millimeter, something like that. That was always had a detonation point of about 7,000 feet. So if you happen to be in that, in that range when you're flying around up there, you definitely would hear it and you would feel it shake the airplane. That's the reason that we went in at 400 or 500 feet. At 400 or 500 feet, the only way that they're going to be able to hit you is if you happen to fly through it. They sit there and they're firing in the air and you happen to fly through it, because they're not going to be able to track you at 500 knots and 500 feet above the ground. So the only time that you were really, really, really going to be a target, let's say you found something and you want to put some ordnance in. Well, now you're a forward air controller, and now you have to roll up high altitude, roll in, fire a Smoky Pete, a rocket in there, so the other people would know exactly where. You say, okay, I'm a little off, hit 50 yards to the right of my target or my smoke. So then you were very vulnerable when you were putting in marking ordnance for another airplane that had ammunition, because all you had on the up north, all we had were 20 Mike we carried, and we also just had the rockets for just marking a target. They call them Willie Pete's.
Well, and with that too, whether you're marking or if you're the one that's just on the gun run and you've taken some battle damage, were the fuel lines and the hydraulic lines pretty well protected in the F-100?
No, they weren't protected at all. But when you're talking about hydraulics and fuel, they're pretty small lines. I mean, someone would have to be lucky to hit one, and it happened all the time. I got hit and I lost all my hydraulics, but it didn't. They weren't large and they weren't protected. No. Mm-mm.
So what's the procedure when you lose all your hydraulics? What do you go through then?
Well, you pray a lot. No, actually, the only time that you really have problems, in other words, if you lose all your hydraulics, bingo, instantly you're out of the airplane. But if your hydraulic line is hit, and usually it was a slow leak, you would want to get on the ground really, really quick. And once you got below a certain speed, 150 knots, you had what was called a ram air turbine.
RAT for the acronym, right?
Yeah, which you would pop out, in this case on the side of the airplane, the F-100 came out, and that would drive what hydraulics you had left until you got on the ground, until you hit the ground and rolled out down to about 120 knots, something like that. So that came in handy. Well, I had used the old ram air turbine a couple times.
Now, in situations where you've got to use the RAT system, do you let ATC know that you've got hydraulic lines out and they've got crashed crews and everybody out there?
Yeah. You let them know and have the equipment standing by, and because once you land that airplane, you're not taxiing. You're stopping straight ahead, and they're going to have someone out there to hook it up and get it off the runway so the runway's clear. No, when you land and roll out and stop, and then the airplane belongs to maintenance. You're through with it.
Now, in your time, did you ever have any small arms or even shrapnel come through the canopy?
No, I never did. Nope.
Well, and with that too, with the flying, the various bomb runs and areas that you could operate in, I know you mentioned some of the restrictions about flying over North Vietnam, but were there other restrictions in no-fly zones as well?
No, it was, the only restrictions that were placed upon you is with a forward air controller had, certain and it was pretty much carte blanche everywhere in South Vietnam. That obviously, I have to unequivocally say no, where there were no restrictions. Mm-mm.
Well, and when it came down to it with that mindset as well, and the flying that you eventually end up doing up north, what was the farthest you ever penetrated in North Vietnam into airspace?
Vinh, yeah. There was a big air base at Vinh where they had MiGs. And how far into North Vietnam that was, I can't remember, maybe 50 miles, I think, something like that. But it was the most furthest south air base that the North Vietnamese had was in Vinh.
And when you would fly those missions up to Vinh, what was the goal of the mission?
The goal of the mission was we weren't supposed to be there. We weren't supposed to go across the border, but being, fighter pilots and, want to see if we can arouse the enemy a little bit, we would, 50 miles isn't very far. You're talking about just a matter of a couple minutes. So we would go up there and fly down the runway at 50 feet, fast as we could go, and pull up an afterburner and do a roll and take off and look behind us to see if they launched anybody. They never did. I don't know, but so we never incited them to get into a dogfight, although we tried. But every mission we pretty much went up to Vin. Weren't supposed to be up there, but we were there. Yeah.
Now, for F-100 at 50 feet above the runway, that's got to be one hell of a wake-up call for some North Vietnamese fighter pilots and crew.
Yeah. Well, but we were in and out of there in a microsecond. So, anytime that, we went down, did a low flyby there, they would, if they tried to launch and catch us, we'd be so far back down south, again, 50 miles, and they never tried to come down and fly over the south. I don't know what their restrictions were, and the fact they probably figured they'd get shot down if they did. Only up further north in Vin is where the SAMs were. We never had any SAM activity, although we did. They reported SAM activity on a trail, but I never personally had a SAM fire at me, just AAA.
Now, with the flights you flew in, did you ever have any SAM fire at your wingman?
No, never did. No. Mm-mm. And of course, you never flew formation up there on the trail. That was all single ship. The only formation you flew were in the south. Yeah, there was no.
Well, and speaking of the flying up north, because down south you're with the 615th. Well, what inspired you to go up north to Misty and fly with the 309th?
Yeah, I just. Well, I'll tell you what inspired me was the fact that when I decided I was going to get out of the service, and I'm at Phan Rang, they said, oh, I think we're going to send you down to 7th Air Force headquarters in a ground position down there to finish out your flying. And I said, I do not want to do that. So I said, I would like to go ahead. I've got experience. I'd like to go to Misty and volunteer for that. And so the guy says, well, let me call up here. And they called and they said, yeah, we need pilots. We always need pilots. So in retrospect, I have to say I was threatened to be put into a ground position because I was getting out of the service. And I raised my hand and said, no, I want to go to Misty. And they accommodated me. So I was lucky in a way that I was able to finish out that year over there, flying the mission I flew. But they had other plans for me, and I avoided those, thank goodness.
Took fate by the balls, essentially.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of Misty in itself, because a lot of the viewers that have seen this have probably never heard of the Misty Mountain FAC. So where did the name come from?
The Bud Day, who was chosen as the first commander of Misty 1, who was shot down early in his Misty flying and spent 7 or 8 years in Hanoi, his favorite song was Misty. And so they said, and they were trying to come up with a call sign. He says, how about Misty? And they said, well, you're the boss. You can call it whatever you want. So it came from the song Misty is where the name came from.
Now, with that being developed there too, what was the mission of Misty?
Well, the mission was initially, back in the mid-'60s, that mission was there. I don't know what it was called, but they were flying it with OV-1s and OV-2s. And they were getting shot down. And the brass at 7th Air Force says, we can't tolerate this rate. We're losing airplanes left and right and pilots left and right. So they came up with the idea, well, let's put a fast mover up there. And why they chose the F-100 over the F-4 or maybe the Navy doing it with their equipment they have over there, I have no idea. But in '67, they said, we've got to we got to stem this loss rate that we have. And we still had a high loss rate in the F-100, but not as high as the OV-1s and 2s we're having up there. So it came about out of necessity. They needed a fast mover, and they needed a two-seater up there. So, and they had a lot of F-100s in country. They had more F-100s in country than any other type of airplane. There were four bases: Phuket and Phan Rang, Tui Wa, and Tan Son Nhut were all F-100 wings. So they had over 200 airplanes in country, F-100s. And each wing had several F models for training, which you had to have, two-seaters. And they said, that's our best asset right there, is to take the F-100 two-seaters and put them on that mission up north. So I think out of sheer numbers that the F-100s they had over there in country versus anybody else, in fact, nobody else, I don't know what Da Nang, and Da Nang ended up having F-4s here, but that was the only other airplane besides the F-100 that was stationed in country. All the rest of them were in Thailand, or as in the Navy's case, off the carriers.
Off at Yankee Station.
Yep. So really, the F-100 was the only choice that they really had, available choice, readily on hand, that they could use. So that's why they got that mission, and the name came from Bud Day's favorite song,
Misty. Well, once you arrived at Tui Wa, how many squadrons were flying the Misty mission?
Oh, just one. Yeah, and we were just a detachment assigned to the 309th. In other words, that's where we did our briefing. We hung our parachutes and G-suits and whatever. And we just used available space there, because that was also an active 100 squadron. And I don't know, I think when they were at Phuket, I think they were with the 415th. But I wasn't up there. I landed at Phuket a couple times, but not as a Misty. So when they moved us down to Tui Wa, they had to assign us to some squadron. So they ended up doing the 309th.
Now, when you arrive at Tui Wa, what's your impression of Misty, the program, and its commander at the time?
Oh, it was phenomenal. The commander that had just left was Tony McPeak, who ended up being 4 stars and head of the Chief of Staff of the United States. And he was still there. And the guy that came in while I was here and replaced him, I'm trying to think, I can't remember his name right off the bat. He ended up getting 2 stars. So it was a well-led organization. They placed very experienced officers in command of it. And then after he left, and I'll probably think of his name, another guy came in that was stationed at Wethersfield with me, but in the 55th over there. And he got shot down and killed shortly after he got online as commander of Misty. But yeah, well led. Yeah, well manned. Everybody there that participated in Misty had a lot of experience, a lot of flying experience. They wouldn't take you on board unless you were, experienced. Yeah.
Well, and looking at the book that I showed you earlier, of course, I know in the back of the book it shows the mission totals just for the Misty mission. And a lot of these guys are pushing 70s, 80s, 90s,
yes.
100 plus.
Well, it was, and that's the reason they said, because of the fact that early on, Jonesy Jones is one of them that I think he may have cracked 100 missions. But there was, they said, hey, we're losing a lot of guys, so we're going to limit it to 60 missions. And from probably mid-60, I don't know when, but after about a year of not having a limit on the missions, they said, okay, now it's going to be 60. So you were there for 4 months, flying 15 missions a month. Every other day you flew a mission, and then you were gone. Well, as I told you, I was had about 3.5 months to go when they said, okay, I think we're going to put you in a desk job somewhere because you're getting out of the service. So when I got up there, I didn't have 4 months. I had 44 missions, so 3.5 months or something like that. I was up there, but everybody that was up there at the same time, shortly before, and after, were all limited to 60 missions. You rotated in, flew your 60, and you were out back into a regular unit, or in my case, deployed back to the States.
Now, if let's say that I hit my 60 mission mark, I'm sure there's a celebration, but could I try to sign on for an additional 60 missions, or not
No,
allowed?
no. Uh, you might have tried to do it. I don't know if anybody did do it or not, but I think that was a hard fast rule that you were 60 and out. Yep.
Now, with the Misty program when you were there, because you're there from what, June 20th
Yeah.
until September?
Yep. End of September. Yep.
And so you're flying every other day, however, but how many missions is Misty flying a day total?
4.
4 a day. In the
4 day.
morning?
4 day. First takeoff's at 6 o'clock. And then the last one lands late at night, 9, 10 o'clock at night before you get back and land. And you actually overlap. When you finish, or you're on your last run before you've already hit the tanker twice, the other mission will be launching and coming in. So there's not a gap. It's an overlap type thing. And you communicate on the way out as he's entering. And you had certain points where you entered. So, you made sure that he was on the target, or on his run by the time you pull off on yours and start heading back.
Now, for you, before you even fly your first mission with Misty, is there any kind of procedures or training that you?
Oh
have
yeah,
to go
you
through
had
with
to
Misty?
you had to have a couple rides with an instructor, just mainly orientation rides. The boundaries, what you're looking for up there, and everything else. And so after 2 rides, then you're turned loose, and you're flying with different people. And there were always, I can't remember that. We had probably 15 in the squadron at a time, something like that. I don't think there were any more than 15.
Well, and with that, I mean, you get to know the guys in the squadron pretty close then.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because every other mission, you're in the back seat, and he's doing the flying primarily. Only time you in the back seat that you might take over if he just needs a rest. And that's probably en route to the tanker or en route home. And so in the back seat, you're just a pair of eyes looking out, and you had, like I told you, a handheld camera, which you're trying to take pictures of what you see, because you're like this all the time. You're never flying this way. You're always in a 60 or more degree bank across the road, back and forth like
watching
this.
the trails.
Yeah.
Well, and with that, thinking about it as well, when you're alternating as a back seater or flying in the front seat, would it be the same guy that you're operating with, or would it be interchangeably?
Yeah. No, you may be with Joe Blow, and you're in the front seat, and he's in the back. And the next day you may be with Sam, and he's in the front seat, and you're in the back seat. So you were never teamed up with anybody. It was just sort of just random. And meaning every day there were 8 pilots that flew. So with that in mind, we had to have at least 16, because the next day, you're off. You're only flying every other day. So I guess counting the commander and the ops officer plus the members of the unit, yeah, we had at least 16, more than that.
Well, and with that, leading up to your first mission, of course, with Misty, was there a procedure for if the Sabre was hit on where to eject and how to try to evade capture and whatnot?
Yeah. You always headed toward water, because the safest place to jump out was over the water. And if you could make it feet wet, as they call it, they would have a ship or a helicopter on location. I mean, they were launched immediately, and so and they could track, and you could tell them about where you were and where you're. But you always wanted to try and get out. If the engine was still running, altitude, that was your best thing, and head for the South China Sea.
Well, in your time there flying in those 3.5 months at Misty, How many F-100s were shot down, if any were shot down at all?
Oh yeah, we first mission I was there, we lost a couple, and we went out for search and rescue. They launched us prematurely because we had to go on search and rescue and try and find them. It was over land somewhere. Never did. They were presumed killed. They weren't captured because when we got there, the enemy was all around them, but we never made any contact, on radio with them at all. So I'd say 150 some, and so let's say 30 some 5 were shot. I'd say probably 20 were shot down prior to me getting there, and then afterwards about close to 15 were shot down. Even though we weren't flying up north that last several groups that were there, we still got they still had a lot of AAA on the trail to fire at us. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned your first mission being launched prematurely on search and rescue. Who was the crew that was shot down?
Let me see on this thing. Gorley was one, and I'm trying to think who was with him. No, Scotty Dotson was one that was shot down, and we never found him. And yeah, there he is. Scotty, Lee Gorley. I was right on Gorley. So those two are the ones that were shot down, and we never found him. Yep.
So was there ever any inquiry and investigation to figure out what happened to him?
Well, no. Obviously, that was enemy territory, so you really couldn't send a crew in there to try and evaluate what went wrong, what have you. So no, but it was not. The aircraft just didn't quit flying; they were shot down.
Were their remains ever recovered?
No. Mm-mm.
Still missing in action to this day.
Mm-hmm. Now they're for benefits to the families. They were KIA eventually,
right?
But took years before they reclassified them as KIA. Yeah.
So for you in that first mission, did the reality kind of set in of the dangers that you were dealing with?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because, and I say the first day, it might have been the second day, but it was right after I got there is when they got shot down. Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy, that was an eye opener. I said, "What am I getting into here?"
Well, and with that loss taking place, how quickly would the crew be replaced by 2 other volunteers?
Right away. There were enough people with their hands in the air, to volunteer for that particular mission. Yeah.
Now, for yourself, do you remember your first mission flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail with Misty?
Yeah, I was with a guy named George Bukowski, who I knew quite well from England. He was up at Lakenheath in the 48 up there, and he ended up getting out also, and we flew back together same time, and he went with Delta Airlines. But yeah, he's the one that checked me out on our first flight up there. Yep.
So for that first mission, for yourself there, what do you remember about it?
Well, I remember that we got into, I was flying up front. George was the instructor checking me out and pointing out this and that. And we got into a situation where we're taking a lot of ground fire and we're trying to locate it. And, and I'm flying up front. And the next thing I know, I looked down, I said, "Man, George, we got to get some fuel." Well, I had gone into afterburner, and I'm flying around in afterburner, looking at the ground and maneuvering and everything else. And I damn near ran us out of fuel. I said, "George, where'd all our gas go?" And then I realized, oh, excuse me, and I pulled it back out of afterburner. I said, "We're going to hit the tanker." We got up there, we got fuel and went back in. But in the heat of the moment, being shot at like that and maneuvering around trying to find out where that ground fire was coming from, I had put it in afterburner and almost ran us out of gas.
Well, and from your perspective too, in that situation, you're at what, 500, 400 feet?
When you're flying, yeah, you're supposed to be right around 500 feet, but there's so much up there. It's hilly. There's cars everywhere, and of course the road is down in a valley with sheep cars on the either side, and so you're you're 500 feet going like this, but you also it's like flying down the Grand Canyon. You got walls and on either side of you, so you're really jinking back and forth on pretty tight turns just to stay within the parameter that you got to work with there.
Now, from your perspective as well, over the trail, what does the trail look like from 400 to 500 feet?
Oh, it's just it's a dirt path. Is all it is. Jungle, basically, uh, and that's the reason that they had these massive truck parks where they would eat during the day. Because when these convoys came down, there would be up to I must say 60, 70 trucks coming down, and they couldn't travel during the day.
Right.
So they would have these massive truck parks. Well, it wasn't like a Walmart parking lot. And it wasn't, spaces marked off and asphalt. It was all underneath the trees, and it was really hard to see. And plus, they were camouflaged. So every now and then, you got good enough where you could look for a glint off the sun. You wouldn't actually see a vehicle down there, but you pick up what was that, and a glint or something, the sun shining off a windshield or off a something that would reflect, and you were able to get pretty good after a period of time of finding these truck parks. And if you found a truck park, it was bonanza, man. It was like hitting a jackpot in an arcade. You would put all the ordnance you could get in there and score some big hits. And the other thing was too, like I said, if you're first out in the morning and something happened mechanically to that lead truck coming down that road, they couldn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't get around them, and they weren't going to be able to back up very fast to find a place to get out in these truck parks. And so that would be also a shooting gallery too. This line of trucks that are marooned on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So, but you had to really, over time, you got experience on what to look for, and every now and then, nature would help you out with a mechanical failure on some of these trucks, and you would get lucky. And but at great cost, the amount of people that were shot up, shot down.
Well, with the flying that you do up there and with those 44 missions, how many truck parks did you stumble upon?
Coming down the entire length of the trail, and I don't remember exactly how many miles from the border down, but of course, once you got into the North Vietnam, it was all paved highway. But down through Laos, several hundred miles, there were four known that we knew of to look for, and but those were constantly changing because once we found a truck park,
They move it.
yeah, absolutely, and all it's not really a park; it's just underneath the canopy of trees. They would find places to put the trucks, well camouflaged by the jungle.
So in our flying, if we find a truck park and we get on the radio and let a Ford air controller know, or are we immediately?
We are the air controller.
And you?
Yeah.
Will you call in support from perhaps any available units in the area?
Whoever is the closest, whoever can come and give us what we need. In other words, we would have to specify that we would want CBUs, although CBUs weren't very good in the jungle, cluster bomb units. But so mainly you're looking for bombs. Rockets weren't that effective either, unless you had a clear target to shoot at. So mainly bombs, and then if they started to scatter, in other words, you hit something, they're getting pretty close and they scatter, and then your 20 mic would come in handy. So we had a selection. Usually, most of ours would come from the Navy because they're right out there in the sea. The carriers were right there, and they're sitting alert too all the time. So rather than have a land-based aircraft or formation come, I'd say that most of the time, 80% of the time, we would put in Navy ordnance.
Now, would that be Navy F4s and A4s?
Yeah. They had a lot of, most of them were A4s in the late 60s, like that. There were some F4s, but most of the F4s were out of Thailand, were Air Force. So from the Navy, most of them were A4s.
Now, once we found a truck park, you've of course called in for additional support, perhaps off of Yankee Station. When those A4s arrive and they ask you to mark the target, do you put one Willie Pete around at the front of the truck park and one at the end?
No, you would just drop one, uh, and then unless it was an errant drop. In other words, forget about that one. I'll put another one in there. That's not even close. And then from that Willie Pete that you put in, the smoke coming up, you would give him directions. Yeah, hit my mark, or move it such and such to the left, right, up and down, what that. So because you're talking about ballistic bombs that are not really smart. You're just trying to drop bombs and hope that you hit a target. Now you can't see the target very well. It's there's a canopy down there in the jungle, but you know that it doesn't matter. Bombs don't have to hit a target right. This area of saturation is what you're looking for. So
The bigger the tonnage, the bigger the
yeah,
saturation.
yeah. So you're just looking to put something down there that might do some residual damage and not necessarily a direct hit.
So when you launch a Willie Pete rocket, how long will that smoke stay on the ground before it starts to dissipate?
Yeah, it depends upon the wind. Usually, you certainly got enough time to drop ordnance on it. Let's say it hits the ground, smoke comes up, hit my smoke. These guys are ready. I mean, you don't drop that thing till they're on target, armed and ready to drop. So from the time that you say hit my mark, they're rolling in. We're talking a matter of 30 seconds before that ordnance is off their airplane, and they're coming back around to drop again. So I never had a problem where the smoke dissipated to the point where I had to drop another one just because of dissipation. So by the time that you put that smoke on the target and clear them in hot, it's well less than a minute. Yeah.
So when the A4s are coming in hot, let's say that they're coming in from bearing 270, as the FAC, are you orbiting above them at say 1,500 feet, guiding in the strikes and taking
Well,
a BDA?
yeah, I'm not necessarily above them so much as I'm off the side.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm up high enough. I'm now not down at my 500 feet because I've had to climb up to go up that Willie Pete. And then afterwards, I know in that area that what sort of ordnance they may have on the ground. So I try to get an altitude where I can concentrate on their bombs where they drop and not have to worry about taking hostile fire in. So sometimes you would, climb up 10, 11,000 feet, weather permitting, and do your facking from that altitude as far as guiding them in.
Wow. Now, once the A4s have, or whoever
Yeah.
has flown, have dropped all their ordnance, do you then fly down at low level and you use the first indention on the camera to take a BDA?
You would try and go down there and get some pictures of what happened because you got to go back and debrief intelligence and give them some idea of a battle assessment of what transpired, what you think was down there, how accurate it was, how many that you perhaps put out a commission. You have to give them an estimate anyway, so you'd have to go back and do a flyby to get that estimate.
Now, in any of your flybys, did you ever let loose any of those 20 millimeters on anything that was perhaps left over?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. There's a lot of times we came back with no ammunition at all. So almost every mission we would expend our cannon fire. Yeah.
Now, in your time in those 44 missions, what is the largest truck convoy or truck park that you know that you witnessed, marked, and helped destroy?
I have no idea how big it was. The one that I know that was big was when we caught them on the road. Like I said, truck broke down, and there had to be about 60 trucks. I mean, I couldn't count them because you're flying and what you're trying to do is obviously knock out the ones in the front because you don't want, and also the ones in the back, so they're trapped. So we did not get all of the trucks that time. That's a lot of trucks, but we probably put at least a dozen out of commission out of that, say 60 that were in that convoy. Yeah.
Now, when
That
you
was
spot
big.
a convoy as a FAC, do you have time to call in for support, or do you take matter into your own hands to try to knock out what you can?
No, no. Yeah. In other words, if let's say the target is moving and you want to immobilize it before because you don't have, let's say your support's not in the air yet, or they haven't left the carrier or haven't left the base. Yeah, then you go ahead and use your 20 mic to try and immobilize the convoy so it couldn't move any further. I never had I never caught one moving like that. No, but that's yeah. Once you were up on that trail, you were the boss. You didn't have to ask anybody anything about, can I go in hot here and do this and do that. Once you left the ground at your base and headed in to the trail, everything, whatever you want. It's carte blanche. You just drop what you want, call in what ordinance you want. Don't ask permission for anybody. Now, we did have a lot of times that we had to coordinate with AB. Our communication was an airborne command post, ABCCC.
Hillsboro, right?
Mm-hmm. Hillsboro. And a lot of times, even though they operated usually at night, the C-130 gunships would be on the trail. So we had to make sure that we knew exactly where the gunships were and they'd tangle up with them.
I bet that was a sight to see as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man, I tell you. I never saw them fire, because they operated mainly at night because it was not safe for them to be on the trail during the day. But I've seen pictures of them firing those things, and they're almost moving the airplane sideways. They fire those. It's 20 millimeter is what they're firing. Yeah.
So with these missions that are being flown by Misty, of course, and once you get in these areas, with you being the boss, low level altitude, being that you're fighter pilots, a lot of them are young or at least jovial in itself. Did you ever buzz any villages, low level altitude, just for the heck of it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I can remember one time. This was not a joy thing, but a lot of times you would buzz a lot of villages, and also our friendlies too. We had a base; it was an army base down near Saigon, and I can't remember exactly, but it had maybe a 2,000-foot strip out in the middle of the jungle, paved, and I went down there on an OV-10 one time and hung out with those guys and flew in their helicopters. There's little Bell helicopters, and they're out there, taunting the enemy and firing at them, and the enemy's firing back. And we're in a helicopter. I mean, glass enclosed helicopter. And I said, "You guys are crazy. Crazy. What am I doing here?" Well, every now and then I'd give them a call when I was down that way flying a mission. On the way back, we're clean. I'd do a flyby. I couldn't land. It was only a 2,000-foot strip. But I would come down, and give them a flyby and let them know I'm coming, and they'd all be out there on top of their vehicles and what have you. So there was a lot of that went on. And then I can remember one time, and it was the closest I ever came to dying. I got target fixation. And I'm down there in 4 Corps, and I've got a couple sampans that were on the Mekong. And they're down there hosing away, and I saw them. And this was target of opportunity. There was no FAC around at all. So I got a hold of, I can't remember who I got a hold of, a command post, and said, "I'm going to go ahead and hose these guys down." So I went in there and I started firing, and I'm firing, and the next thing I know, man, I am almost in the water. And I pull the thing up, nose up, and now I'm just about to stall. I swapped ends so fast in that thing. And I don't dare hit afterburner, because I'm afraid if I get a soft light and it doesn't light up, I'm going to be in the drink. And the Mekong is like it is the river. It's back and forth like this. So I'm hovering probably a few feet above the river. Well, I'm blowing waves up that would probably sink a sampan even if I didn't hit it. And my airspeed starts building up. And I must have been down that river just like water skiing back and forth for what seemed like a long time before I finally got enough airspeed to get up and get out of that situation. But the only thing that kept me from actually going in was ground effect. In other words, you compress air between yourself and the ground, which actually acts as sort of a compressed layer to give you some lift. But man, I came so close to totaling an airplane just because I got target fixation trying to hit those sampans. I didn't get the sampan, by the way, but anyway, that's. I went back from that and I just said, "Man, don't ever. You learn by your mistakes. That was one big mistake. Don't ever do something like that again."
Well, in the world of flying fighter jets at low level altitude, your lesson learning opportunity is a small window as well.
Oh yes, Yeah, you could. I mean, you make a mistake, and you don't have too many chances after that. It could be fatal, especially when you're down there in enemy territory. Even if I was able to get out of that airplane, I was probably going to be, captured. Yeah.
Well, and think about this too with your time in country. I mean, in total, you flew 194 missions
Yep.
south and with Misty. And so when you hit your 100 mission mark flying down south, was there a celebration for that?
No, there was never a celebration. Well, now when I left Misty, there was a big celebration. The last mission you come down, they hose you down and everything. Champagne bottles come out and everything else like that. But down south, there was no, mm-mm. There was no just see you later type thing. Yeah.
Now, and I know we mentioned this in the first one too, but at some point in your tour, you get R&R. And so where did you end up taking R&R to?
I got two. I talked about it two. First one, I'm at Phan Rang, and I wanted to go to Australia. And it happened to be down there at that time that Apollo lands on the moon. And I couldn't spend a dime. I mean, I'd go into a pub, a restaurant, whatever, and they're patting me on the back just because I'm an American. And here, Apollo 11 or whatever it was lands on the moon, and so it was fantastic. And then when I got back, and then I moved up to Tuiwa to Misty, I raised my hand for an R&R, and they gave me another R&R. So I went to Hong Kong on the second one, and all I did up there was just have clothes made and buy camera equipment and what have you. So I ended up doing a week in Sydney, and then a week in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Still got the camera and the clothes?
No, no. I don't know what went first. Probably the clothes went first. The camera went when everything went digital. Now you don't have all these lenses that you screw on, and I don't know if you can go out and buy any Fiji film or not. I don't know if they even make film anymore because everything's digital nowadays.
Well, for our last question for today's interview, when you get to Misty, what was your call sign with Misty?
It changed every day. Depends. If you went off the first mission, you were Misty 1-1. Second mission, Misty 2-1. Misty 3-1 and Misty 4-1. It was always, would depend upon what mission that day you were flying with Misty. It was always 11, 21, 31, or 41.
Right.
Yeah.
And then for when you arrive at Misty, what number pilot were you to have flown with Misty? Do you recall? Because you've got Misty 1 was the first one. What were you? Were you Misty 117?
Well, that was the number. I mean, I was 117th that went through the Misty program.
That's
out of
exactly what I was asking.
157, something like that. Yeah. But like I said, the call signs were always the same, no matter who you're flying with. Or it all depends upon if you're the first mission of the day, second mission, or third or fourth. Yeah.
And I guess this will be the actual last question because it just popped into my head. Has there been any program like Misty that was ever attempted elsewhere in Vietnam or since Vietnam?
Oh no, I can't answer that. I don't know. I don't think so, because I don't think we've ever been in a situation where we needed a high speed FAC mission. Certainly not in Afghanistan. That was not much of an air war there at all. As far as I don't know, the first Iraqi war, I don't know. I really don't. I don't think so. That was also mainly, well, both. But no, I would have to say if there was, I'm not aware of it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Well, TK, as always,
Okay.
thanks for your service and
I
welcome
enjoyed
home.
it. Thank you.
Thank you.